Brendan Dassey trial transcript day 3, page 85, continuing cross-examination of Sherry Culhane. I examined some swabs were taken by someone else and those were submitted. I examined those and then in addition to that, examined the headboard. Did you actually again start with determination of whether there was blood on the headboard? Yes, I did a visual examination to see if any stains were consistent with the appearance of blood, and then there were different types of various stains, which I checked with the presumptive test, and they were all negative. So no blood on the headboard? Correct. And on the swabs of the headboard or spindles that someone else had taken but you tested? Right. No blood? Correct. Were you able to develop any sort of DNA profile from the headboard or those swabs? No, the headboard itself, I didn't actually take any swabs myself because there was nothing that looked like blood. The swabs from the headboard, I will have to check and see if I actually extracted those. No, those were not extracted. They were all negative for any blood, so I didn't go any further with them. Now, is there a reason why you didn't want to determine if there was any sort of biological fluid that might provide you with a profile, a DNA profile? Well, at this point, I was simply focusing on the blood, possibility of any blood, so no, I did not. I made the decision not to go any further with that. But on other items, you went beyond determination of blood to determine if there was some sort of other biological sample that might be able to provide you with a DNA profile, correct? Correct. And in most of those cases, it was items that were thought to have been touched by someone. And again, in this particular item of evidence, we were focusing on the presence of or absence of blood. Did you yourself do the swabs of the RAV4? Yes. And that would be interior and exterior? Yes. All the swabs except, do you mean did I collect them? Yes. Yes, I collected all the swabs that I examined from the RAV4 except for the hood latch, which was swabbed by someone else, and there were also some swabs from a battery cable and some interior door handles that were collected by someone else. But regardless of who collected it, you did the testing on it? Oh, yes, I did. Okay, now when you actually collected, let me start there first. Did you collect a swab from obvious places that a person might use to open up the vehicle, like for instance a door handle? Again, I didn't swab those areas, so someone else swabbed those areas, but I'm assuming that's what they did, is take them from obvious areas where someone would have touched. Did each swab indicate where they came from on the vehicle? Yes. And do you recall whether there were swabs of the cargo door handle? The back, the very back, I did take a swab of, and I believe it was my item A23, because analyst was processing that area and saw something and I did swab that area and I did extract it. Okay, you did extract a sample? Yes. And that was human or non-human blood? It was positive for blood because the presumptive test was positive, but it was inconclusive because the profile was too partial. I could not make any kind of conclusion, so that was inconclusive. So you were unable then to go further and determine if that had any sort of a DNA profile, whether it be a partial profile or a full profile. I did get a partial profile, but it was inconclusive because sometimes if a partial profile only shows up one or two types, then we usually report that as inconclusive because that's got really enough genetic information to report that. So in this case, it was inconclusive. So on direct, for example, you had been asked by Attorney Gahn about partial profiling. Yes. Or a partial profile, excuse me. Yes. And for instance, I believe it was one where there were 7 characteristics. Yes. Of 15, is that right? Yes. And you were able to come up with a partial profile, but here you're saying it was probably more like 3 characteristics? Yes, right. So because it was so little, you weren't able to come up with something that you can even give a partial profile to? Correct. Okay, now, and the items that you were able to obtain a DNA profile within the RAV4, were you able to match any of that DNA profile in comparison to Brendan Dassey's profile? No, none of the samples that I were able to develop a profile were consistent with his profile, but they were consistent with Stephen Avery and Teresa Halbach. And Teresa Halbach, yes. So you were able to match it with somebody, correct, just not Brendan Dassey? That's correct. I believe you also looked at a jacket and a pair of jeans, correct? Yes, I did. I believe that was your designation IJ and IK? That's correct. Did it indicate who those jeans were from? Yes, I was told they belonged to Brendan Dassey. And were you able to determine whether there was any blood on those jeans? Yes, they were both negative for blood, and the jacket as well. And the jacket as well, yes. And again, did you go any further then to determine any blood and determine some sort of other DNA that might be available from the jeans or the jacket? No. Just the blood? Correct. Now, again, was that your decision or did someone else tell you we're just looking for blood? Well, it depends on the type of case. In most cases, if we're looking for something like blood, then we focus on blood. A lot of times there are lots of different types of stains on clothing or bedding or whatever, and some of those biological materials we have presumptive tests for, and some we don't. We don't test every stain that we encounter. And in this case, like I said, I was focused on whether there was blood there or not, and it was negative. So no blood on Brendan's jeans? Correct. Or on his jacket? Correct. Speaking of bedding, did you have an opportunity to review any bedding that was provided to you by law enforcement or other members of the crime lab? No. Were you aware that bedding had been seized? I don't believe so. So no one told you about the bedding? I don't recall, no. And if there was any possible biological samples from the bedding, we won't know about it, right? Unless you get to look at it to determine if there's an extractable sample? Correct. Were you provided with any shell casings to determine any sort of, whether there was any sort of biological sample that you could provide or develop a profile? No, I did not look at the shell casing. No, I did not. Now, you said you didn't look at the shell casings. You were aware there were shell casings? I believe there was some submitted, but they wouldn't have come to me, so I don't really have any knowledge of them. So again, if they don't give them to you, you can't tell us if there's any sort of DNA that you can extract from those shell casings. Is that correct? That's correct. Did you have an opportunity to look at a large car hood? I think it's referred to as a rambler hood. No. Any cardboard boxes provided to you to determine whether there might be some blood or extractable DNA? No. Were you aware of any? No, I don't recall. Okay, I believe you may have already testified as to Exhibit 211. Do you recall this item? Yes, the key. You had an opportunity, as you testified, to develop a DNA profile on two subjects from the key, correct? I'm sorry, could you repeat that? Sure, that was kind of confusing. You had an opportunity to review the key, correct? Yes. And from that key, you were able to obtain some trace biological sample? Yes. And from that, you were able to develop a DNA profile? Correct. And I believe your testimony was that it reflected that of Stephen Avery? Yes. Was there also a mix, including that of Teresa Halbach, on the key? No. Just Stephen Avery? Correct. Was Brendan Dassey's DNA on that key? No. Was there any blood on the key? There was no visually anything that looked like blood. The swabbings that I took from the key there was nothing consistent with the appearance of blood. I did not do any preliminary testing for blood on that. Okay, and if I may just ask, why not? Well, because in a sample like this, when something is that small, the important part in most cases is whose DNA is there. So I made the decision that I was probably working with a limited amount of sample, and I wasn't going to waste any of that on a preliminary result that really didn't give us very much information. I'm going to show you what's been marked as Exhibit 92, and do you recall this exhibit? Yes, and that, I believe, has your identification number, CJ2? Correct. And that's a pair of leg irons you were asked to test to see if you could find any extractable DNA? Correct. And were you able to do so? Yes. And whose DNA were you able to extract from that? When I sampled this, I swabbed the inside surface of the round part, and it was a mixture of DNA from more than one individual. Were you able to make any match with any of the known samples you had before you? Stephen Avery, based on his standard sample, he could be included in that mixture of DNA. And Teresa Halbach was excluded? Correct. As well as Brendan Dassey? Yes. So he was specifically excluded from that. Correct. And again, I'm going to show you what's been marked as Exhibit 991. Thank you. And I believe that has, well, first of all, do you recognize that item? Yes, I do. And that has identification number CJ1 on it? Yes. And that's your identification number from the crime lab? Yes. And you had an opportunity again to determine or to swab that and determine if there was any sort of extractable DNA? That's correct. I swabbed the inside surface just like I did with the other cuffs, and I got a mixture of DNA from more than one individual. Did you have the same conclusions with CJ1 that you had with CJ2? Yes, and that would be you could include Stephen Avery as possible match to the DNA. Yes, and exclude Brendan Dassey? Correct. And Teresa Halbach was also not included in that? She was also excluded. Excluded? Correct. Did you review any other leg irons such as these? No. Any other handcuffs? No. Just those two sets? Correct. So if there were any biological samples on these, we wouldn't know because you didn't have a chance to look at them and test them, correct? Correct. Were you asked to obtain any DNA profile from any hair samples? No. Would it have been your duties at the crime lab if, for say, a vacuum were seized to go through it and try to determine if there were any usable hair samples? Yes, in a hair sample, really the only thing that you're looking at is going to be the root portion of a hair. So I would, to see if hairs were suitable for DNA, they would have to contain a root portion. Would someone else first go through it to determine if that's possible before they send it to you? No, I would do that. Okay, and you don't recall at any time in this investigation they asked you to go through any, hair samples that might come from, say, for instance, a vacuum? No. You had testified previously that you had reviewed a bullet fragment. I believe it was your identification FL, correct. There was also a second bullet fragment, correct? Yes, and you also had an opportunity to review that? Yes, and that was, I believe, your designation FK? Yes. Were you able to make any determination of whether, well, first of all, were you able to determine if there was blood on FK? Again, I treated that exactly like I did FL. There was no visual indication of blood, so I did not do any preliminary test on anything. I simply washed that bullet fragment as well, and treated it just like FL. And were you able to extract any sort of a DNA sample for purposes of a comparison? No, I was not able to develop a profile. Now, you weren't the actual technician or the crime scene person who was at the Stephen Avery trailer swabbing potential stains, etc., correct? That's correct, excuse me. Did you observe photographs of items that had been photographs of the trailer or items that they had suspected might be blood or some other sort of biological sample? No, I don't believe so. So when you would get a swab, for instance, it would just say where it came from? Yes. And you recall that there had been some swabs of stains of suspected blood from Stephen Avery's bathroom floor, vanity, and sink? Yes. And you had an opportunity to test all those stains, correct? Yes. And you were able to, well, first of all, was it positive for blood? I tested several different swabs from those areas. I tested 3 from the vanity, 1 from a toilet seat, and 1 from a sink. One of those swabs from the vanity was positive for blood, and 1 from the sink was positive for blood. And you were able then to develop a DNA profile of that blood sample? Or that, yes. Which one? Both of those samples, I'm sorry. One of those samples from the sink was consistent with Stephen Avery. The other, I did not develop a profile. Okay, none were consistent with Teresa Halbach? Correct. And none were consistent with Brendan Dassey? Correct. Do you recall, again, having the opportunity to test a swab of what appeared to be or may have been labeled as a suspected blood found? Suspected blood found by the molding of the bathroom or bedroom door? Yes. And again, you followed the same procedure you just explained? Yes. Were you able to test it positive for blood? That's correct. And again, you were able to develop a profile as to the DNA of that blood? Yes. And that DNA was consistent with Stephen Avery. And again, excluding Teresa Halbach? Yes. And excluding Brendan Dassey? Yes. Some items were sent to the crime lab, number of knives. Were you able to, did you see those knives? Yes, yes. And again, did you go through the same process to make a visual observation to determine if there was any blood on the knives? Yes. Did you also do the same testing you explained earlier about determining if there was positive for blood by using a swab? On some of the knives, yes, I did. If there was nothing visual to look at, no visual type stain, then I just did random swabbings on the blade portion to test for blood. Did you also then test thereafter to determine if there was anything that you could extract from it that would develop into a DNA profile? No. And why didn't you decide to go that far? Well, because again, in a lot of cases, especially with a case of this magnitude, we have to make decisions along the way, what samples to take forward and what and when to stop. And in this case, I was focused on if it was blood. If it was not, so I chose to stop there.